The fire had burned down to almost nothing, and she hadn't bothered to feed it. She sat with her back against a lodgepole pine, her sleeping bag pulled up to her collarbone, watching the last orange ember pulse and fade in the dark. The logging road ran behind her like a forgotten thought. 2 tire ruts pressed into the mountain earth, grass growing tall between them, going nowhere she hadn't already been. She had $34 in the front pocket of her jeans. She had counted it twice that afternoon, as though the number might change. The mountains here were serious mountains. They didn't comfort you, they simply rose, indifferent and enormous, into a sky that in the west gets so dark at altitude that the stars seem less like points of light and more like something structural, like the actual material the night is made of. She had been watching that sky for an hour, not quite thinking, not quite sleeping, when she saw it. At first, she thought it was a rock formation, a pale dome of granite catching the last ghost of dusk along the ridgeline above the tree line. The trees were black silhouettes by then, and the shape sat just above them, round and smooth and entirely wrong for the wilderness. Not organic, not accidental, deliberate. She sat forward. It was small at this distance, maybe the size of her thumbnail held at arm's length. A hemisphere, pale, almost white, just visible against the dark blue of the ridge. Then the last of the western light shifted, and it was gone, absorbed into the mountain dark, the way things disappear at dusk. Not suddenly, but all at once. She stared at the space where it had been for a long time. A water tower, maybe. An old mining structure. A relay station. She ran through the practical explanations like a woman who had learned to be careful with hope, who had learned that the distance between a promising thing and a useful thing is usually longer than it looks. But none of the explanations felt right. A water tower at the ridgeline made no sense. A relay station would have a road, markings, a chain-link fence. Whatever it was, someone had built it up there, and then, apparently, walked away. She lay back down and looked at the stars through the pine boughs, and thought about what it meant to have $34 and a sleeping bag, and no particular reason to go one direction over another. The thought wasn't bitter exactly. It was just the shape of her life at 19, a series of open doors and the chronic, exhausting business of choosing which one to walk through. In the morning, she decided, she would climb toward it. She didn't know why. Maybe because it was the first thing in weeks that had made her sit up straight. Maybe because the mountain was there and the dome was there, and she was here with almost nothing to lose. She closed her eyes. Above the tree line, in the dark, the pale dome waited. The journal entry was dated March 4th, 1931, though she wouldn't read it for another 6 weeks. In it, a man wrote in careful block letters that he had decided. He had been watching the same cluster of stars since he was 8 years old, lying in a wagon bed on his father's property, and he had decided that watching from the valley floor was no longer enough. He wrote, "The air is cleaner at elevation, the seeing is better, and I am tired of borrowing sky." He had already identified the ridge. He had already walked it twice in autumn. He knew the stone up there was good, limestone and granite, solid, and he had a plan for hauling it in sections, by mule and by hand, over however many seasons it required. He was not a young man even then. He did not write as though he expected it to be easy. He wrote as though easy had never been the point. She found the fire road the next morning by accident, which is to say by the method of walking the logging road's shoulder with her eyes up, until she noticed where the brush changed character, where the grasses leaned away from the mountain instead of toward it, pressed back years ago by tires that no longer came. The entrance was overgrown but not entirely consumed. She could see the shape of it, 2 faint parallel impressions curving upward through the pines, the center ridge still faintly bald, as though the road were holding its breath. She shifted her pack and started climbing. The air thinned faster than she expected. By the first quarter mile, the logging road noise had dropped behind her, and the only sounds were her own footsteps, and the wind working through the upper branches, and the occasional sharp percussion of a woodpecker somewhere to the east. The pack felt heavier than it had on flat ground, the sleeping bag compressing against her shoulders, the canteen shifting with each step. She had filled it at the creek below. She had eaten the last of her crackers for breakfast, and had not been sentimental about it. The road switched back on itself twice in the first mile, clinging to the slope. She could see nothing above the tree line from inside it, just more trees, more switchback, more sky and fragments between the branches. The dome had vanished behind the ridge the moment she started climbing, which meant she had to hold its location in her memory and trust it was still there. She had done that before with other things, trusted that something was still there when she could no longer see it. At the mile mark, judging by time and incline, she stopped and drank and looked back down. The valley was already small and pale below her. The logging road, a thin thread through the trees, her cold camp of the night before, invisible at this distance. She turned back upward. Above her, through a gap in the canopy, she caught the first pale curve of stone. The pale curve of stone resolved itself slowly, the way things do when you've been holding them in your mind too long. First an impression, then a shape, then a fact. She stopped walking when the full structure came into view through the last stand of pines. It was smaller than she'd imagined, and more solid than she'd hoped, which meant the same thing. It was real. The building sat on a leveled pad of mountain granite, stone walls rising 8 or 9 feet before curving inward to meet the rusted dome. The dome itself had gone the color of old blood, streaked with mineral runoff, and patched in places with a greenish corrosion that still, somehow, held. The wooden door was heavy and dark, set into an archway that someone had fitted carefully, with intention. Whoever built this had not been careless. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a moment, not afraid, just still. Then she walked forward and tried the door. July 1934. The building is finished as of last Tuesday, and I have spent the intervening nights in some agitation of spirit, too eager almost to begin the proper work. Tonight the seeing was exceptional. I opened the dome at 9:30 and tracked my cluster from zenith approach through culmination. Nearly 4 hours without interruption. The clockwork held. My hands, which have given me trouble with the cold, cooperated. I recorded position, magnitude estimate, and the slight elongation in the eastern component that I have been watching now for 3 seasons. Below, my room waited with the lamp lit and the kettle set. I am not a man who believes the sky notices us. But tonight, in the particular silence that follows good observation, I thought, this is exactly the right place, and I am exactly the right person to be in it. The padlock was iron, large shackled, and had been there long enough to become part of the door in spirit, if not in fact. She worked at it for nearly an hour. The rock chisel was not designed for this, and she was not impatient, which made the difference. She wedged, rotated, applied pressure at different angles, listened to the small sounds the metal made, and adjusted. Her wrist ached. She stopped twice to shake it out, and once to drink from the canteen. She did not consider quitting, which was not stubbornness. It was simply that she could see what the problem was, and problems she could see she could solve. The shackle gave, with a sound like a small argument ending. She pushed the door open. The air inside was cold and close and still, the particular stillness of a room that has been sealed rather than simply empty. Dust moved in the shaft of light that came in behind her. The telescope rose from the center of the floor, its tube angled toward the dome's slit, one lens visibly dark and wrong. Paper charts had drifted from a collapsed table and lay where they'd fallen, years ago, undisturbed. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in. She did not move in immediately. She stood in the doorway long enough to understand the room, the way it was arranged, the quality of its silence, and then she stepped inside and pulled the door nearly closed behind her, leaving just enough light to work by. The floor was wood-planked over a stone foundation, and it turned underfoot when she shifted her weight near the center. She had not expected that. She stepped back, steadied herself, and realized the entire inner floor was designed to rotate. The telescope mount fixed at its heart, the surrounding ring of planking meant to carry an observer around it in slow degrees. The mechanism had seized long ago. The boards did not move now, but they had been built to. She walked the perimeter of the room slowly, sweeping with her boot sole to clear the worst of the grit and fallen paper, and found a spot near the wall where she thought she could lay her sleeping bag. She was sweeping a section of floor with the side of her hand when she felt it, a seam, not a gap between boards, which she had already noticed in several places, a seam that formed a rectangle. She crouched and ran her fingertip along it, tracing its edges. Roughly 4 feet by 3, set flush with the surrounding planking. So flush she would not have seen it at all if she hadn't been close to the floor. In raking light, feeling rather than looking. She pressed one corner. Nothing. She tried the opposite corner. Still nothing. She sat back on her heels and thought about it. Something counterbalanced, she decided. Something that equalized the weight so the door would neither hang too heavy nor swing too easily. She felt along the seam until she found a small iron ring recessed into the wood, barely proud of the surface. She hooked her finger through it and pulled upward gently, expecting resistance. A chain shifted below. She heard it move before she felt the floor give. A soft clinking, deliberate, like something designed rather than accidental. And then the trapdoor rose with surprising ease, counterweighted exactly as she'd guessed, swinging up and back until it rested open against the floor. Cool air rose from below, not cold like the sealed room above, something quieter than cold. She held the lantern she had not yet lit over the opening and let her eyes adjust. Stone steps, whitewashed walls, a narrow room below, orderly and whole. She climbed down slowly, one hand on the rough wall. The wool blankets on the iron bed were still folded, not collapsed, not decayed into nothing, folded, with the corners aligned. The lanterns on the shelf were arranged by size. The canned goods were stacked in rows, labels facing out. The desk held nothing loose. The room had the character of a place someone had tidied before leaving, not fled. She stood at the bottom of the steps and understood, slowly, that no one had left this room in a hurry. She did not move for a long moment, just stood at the bottom of the stone steps and let the room settle around her like something being remembered rather than discovered. Then she lit the lantern. The match caught on the second strike. She touched the flame to the wick and turned the brass wheel until the light steadied into something warm and even, and the whitewashed walls came alive with it, not blazing, but the soft amber glow of a room that had been waiting patiently for exactly this. She set the lantern on the desk, sat down in the chair behind it. The chair did not creak. It held her weight as though it had expected her. The star maps were rolled and bound with a length of twine, tucked flat against the back edge of the desk. She undid the knot carefully and unrolled them across the surface, weighting the corners with the lantern base and the flat of her palm. They were hand-drawn, every one of them, in a careful, unhurried hand, not printed, not copied from a textbook. Drawn from observation, she understood that immediately. The lines were too personal for anything else. Certain stars were circled twice, certain clusters annotated with small notes in ink, so faded she had to lean close to read them, and even then she could only catch fragments. Unusually bright. 3rd week January. And check again at opposition. And, on the largest map, a single cluster circled in red at the center of the page, with no note beside it at all. Just the circle. As though the notation wasn't necessary. As though he had known he would always remember why. She sat with the maps for a long time. Then, because the journals were the next thing her hands found, not deliberately, just the natural order of a careful search, she reached beneath the iron bed and found the tin box. It was smaller than she'd expected, the size of something you'd keep letters in, olive-colored metal, with a simple clasp and a small keyhole. She tested the clasp. Locked. She held it for a moment, feeling its weight, then set it on the desk beside the maps and did not try again. Not yet. There was something that felt wrong about forcing it. The room had been left in order. Whatever was inside had been closed deliberately. She understood, in some wordless way she couldn't have explained, that the box would open when she had earned the context to understand it. She turned the lantern down slightly and sat in the quieter light. On the inside cover of one of the star maps, she had almost missed it, rolled to the inside, was a single handwritten line, a date. December 1938. And below it, a short sentence written as though answering a question no one had asked aloud. I built the room below because I wanted to sleep beneath a sky that did not move. She read it twice. Then she sat back and looked up at the fixed, dark circle of the skylight above her, and was still. She stayed. That was the whole of her first decision, and it required less thought than she'd expected. She unrolled her sleeping bag onto the narrow iron bed, not replacing the folded wool blankets, but laying her bag beside them, careful not to disturb what had already been arranged. The lantern she set on the writing desk turned low. The tin box she left where she'd placed it, closed and waiting. The first night she slept 9 hours without waking. She couldn't remember the last time that had happened. The week that followed had a quality she had no ready word for. Quiet was part of it, but not all of it. Safety was closer. For the first time in longer than she could clearly trace, she did not sleep with one ear open, did not wake at the sound of a branch or a passing truck, did not calculate, before closing her eyes, where she would go if something went wrong. The room held her in a way she hadn't known a room could, and she let it, without questioning why. She ate sparingly from the shelf, a can of peaches on the second morning, opening it with her utility knife and drinking the syrup slowly, because there was no reason to hurry. Beans on the fourth day, eaten cold and tasting better than they had any right to. She rationed without resentment. There was something clarifying about a shelf of finite things, about knowing exactly what she had. Nights were different from anything she'd known. The skylight above the bed was perhaps 2 feet across, cut into the stone with a care that told her it had not been an afterthought. It framed a fixed patch of sky, the same patch every night, unaffected by the dome's rotation above. She did not know the names of what she saw moving through that circle. She could recognize the moon's edge when it drifted across, and one star that appeared each night at roughly the same position and burned steadier than the rest. Beyond that, she watched without naming, which felt like the right way to begin. On the 5th night, she opened the rolled star maps again, not to study them, but simply to look. Her eye found the same bright point she'd been watching through the skylight, and she traced the map's hand-drawn lines outward from it, following what appeared to be a cluster marked with a small notation in pencil. The handwriting beside it was the same hand that had written on the inside cover of the map, the same hand that had built the room. On the 6th day, she found another journal, tucked flat beneath the desk's single shallow drawer. She opened it to the middle, she wasn't ready for the beginning, and read a single entry dated winter, 1941. The words were plain, unhurried, written by someone who wasn't performing solitude but living inside it. This room, he had written, is the only place I have never once felt restless. She set the journal open on the desk and looked at the sentence for a long time. She kept the journal open on the desk for 2 days. She didn't read further. She just let the sentence sit there like something that needed time to dry. On the 8th morning, she woke before the skylight grayed and lay still, listening to the mountain quiet, the particular quality of silence that had a texture to it, almost like wool. She had been here over a week. She had eaten from the canned shelves sparingly, refilled her canteen from a narrow spring seep she'd found on the eastern slope, and slept more soundly than she had in years. But the sentence in the journal had shifted something. The only place I have never once felt restless. She understood it the way you understand something you haven't yet earned the words for, and understanding it made her want to keep it. That morning she packed what she needed and walked down. The fire road was harder going downhill than she expected. Loose shale and switchbacks the overgrowth had half erased, and by the time the gradient softened into the valley floor, her knees ached and her boots were gray with dust. The 9 miles to town took her most of the morning. She arrived a little before noon, found the library without difficulty, and stood at the door for a moment before going in. The librarian was a woman of 60 or so, who looked at her backpack and said nothing, only pointed her toward the reference section when she asked about county property records. The records themselves were kept on microfiche, long amber spools of photographed documents that she had to thread and scroll by hand. She was patient with it. She had learned patience the hard way. It took her most of an hour to locate the parcel. The land was filed under a family name she recognized from the journal's inside cover, the same surname, the same initial. The last recorded transaction was 1947, a transfer notation referencing an out-of-state relative, no deed of sale, no subsequent recording. After that, nothing. 58 years of nothing. The land had simply sat, uncontested, unclaimed, unremembered. She wrote down every number and notation on a folded piece of paper and sat back from the machine. She wasn't a lawyer. She didn't know what adverse possession meant, beyond the vague outline of it. That a person could, in certain circumstances, claim the right to land they had occupied and maintained over time. But the door looked open, narrow, requiring patience and help she didn't yet have, but open. She was returning the microfiche spool to its sleeve when she noticed a wire rack near the front desk, holding a row of small local history pamphlets, the kind printed on a single sheet and folded into quarters. She took the one labeled Northridge History, Settlement and Early Families. Near the bottom of the second page, a single paragraph mentioned a self-taught astronomer who had constructed an observatory somewhere on the North Ridge during the early 1930s, and had been, the pamphlet noted quietly, well regarded in the valley. She read the paragraph 3 times. She read the paragraph a 4th time, standing at the wire rack with the pamphlet open in both hands. Well regarded in the valley. That was all. No photograph. No full name recorded, just a man, a mountain, and a building he had raised with his own hands, compressed into 4 lines of local history shorthand. She folded the pamphlet carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket beside the paper, with the microfiche notations. Then she walked out into the afternoon light and stood on the library steps for a long moment, watching a pickup truck idle past, going nowhere fast. She was back at the observatory before sundown. The tin box was under the bed exactly where she'd first seen it. A small rectangular thing, dark with age. The lid fitted with a simple barrel lock that had rusted nearly shut. She had tried it twice before without success, and set it aside, telling herself she'd return to it. Now she sat cross-legged on the iron bed, the lantern lit and adjusted to a low, steady burn, and worked the tip of her utility knife into the lock's keyway, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that patience was the only tool that never broke. It took nearly 20 minutes. The lock gave, with a soft click that felt outsized, almost formal. Inside, 7 small journals, cloth-bound, stacked in two neat columns. The cloth was a faded blue-gray, worn smooth at the spines. She lifted the top one and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unhurried and careful. The letters formed with the deliberateness of a man who had taught himself to write well, because precision mattered to him. January 3rd, 1931. First stone of the foundation laid today. Ground harder than expected. This will take longer than I planned, which is no surprise. Most things worth doing take longer than planned. She sat with that for a moment. Then she turned the page. She read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time she reached the fourth journal, mid-1938, the lantern flame had dropped, and she trimmed it without looking up, her fingers finding the wheel by feel. She was inside his life now. The careful observations, the small frustrations. The night he first tracked a particular star cluster for 6 consecutive hours and filled 3 pages, trying to describe what it felt like. Like standing in a room you've always known was there but could never find the door to. She understood that. The fourth journal ended. She set it beside her on the wool blanket and picked up the fifth. Near the middle, the handwriting changed. Still precise, but slower, more deliberate, as though each word was costing him something. October 14th, 1944. The doctor in town was direct, which I appreciated. I asked him to be. She stopped there. The lantern held steady. Outside, wind moved through the pines on the ridge, and somewhere above her, through the circular skylight, the fixed stars had begun to appear. She read until the lantern needed filling. She found the kerosene in a dented tin beneath the shelf, still liquid, still usable, and refilled all 3 lanterns by feel and firelight, her hands steadier than she expected. Then she kept reading. The 5th journal, the 6th, into 1945, and then 1946, the handwriting slowing further, the sentences growing shorter, more considered, like a man choosing only what mattered. He wrote about the telescope's clockwork mechanism, noting which gear had begun to slip. He wrote about the winter quiet. He wrote, once, about a hawk that had taken to roosting on the dome, and whether it could feel the iron rotating beneath it. The final entry was brief. She almost turned the page, expecting more. The veil holds tonight, clear to the east. I said good night to her, as I always do, my name for her, which I will not write here, because some names belong to the speaking, not the page. That was all. She sat with it for a long moment. Then she set the journal carefully on top of the others, aligned the stack, and stood up. Something shifted in her after that. Not grief exactly, she hadn't known him, but something adjacent to it, a sense of obligation, of continuation. She started the next morning. The collapsed outbuilding behind the observatory had 3 sound timber beams left in it. The rest rotted through. She hauled them up by herself in 2 trips, her shoulders burning on the second, and laid them in the main room. The broken table was a matter of replacing 2 legs and tightening the cross brace. She measured by eye, cut with her utility knife, and a flat stone as a guide, and braced the joints with wire, stripped from the ruined shelving. By noon, the table stood level. She tested it with her full weight. It held. She moved through the hidden room methodically after that. The kerosene lanterns came apart, and she cleaned each one. The wick, the reservoir, the glass chimney, until the light they threw was clear and even. She carried the wool blankets outside and hung them over the building's low stone wall, beating the dust out of them in long rhythmic strokes, while the morning air moved through the trees below. She hauled water in her canteen from the spring she'd found on the slope the day before. 6 trips, her legs aching, and scrubbed the whitewashed stone walls with a rag torn from her extra shirt, working section by section until the walls were clean and bright, and the room smelled like stone and pine, and nothing else. She stood in the middle of it when she was finished, lanterns lit, blankets folded, tables steady overhead, star maps rolled and resting. The circular skylight framed a pale square of afternoon sky. She thought, I could stay here. Then, more carefully, I could stay here a long time. The decision formed quietly, the way most of her decisions did. Not as a plan, but as a certainty. She recognized only after it had already taken shape. She would go back to town, not passing through, not stopping long enough to buy crackers and move on. She would stay long enough to ask the questions she had been turning over for weeks. She came down the mountain in the early morning, the fire road still cool and shadowed, dew on the tall grass at the edges. 9 miles was nothing after the summer she'd had. She was in town before the heat settled. The county clerk's office occupied the back half of the post office building, a detail she learned from the woman behind the general store counter, who gave it to her without being asked. The way people in small towns sometimes volunteered information to strangers who looked like they were searching for something specific. The clerk was a compact man in his 60s who listened carefully when she described the property, the stone building, the overgrown fire road, the elevation. He pulled 3 manila folders without apparent urgency and spread them on the counter. The land had been assessed in 1947 and never revisited. The last recorded owner had died without a will. No taxes had been paid in decades. The county, he told her, had procedures for this. Abandoned property claims. She would need to file, to demonstrate occupancy, to wait. He handed her a 2-page form across the counter without ceremony. She folded it carefully and placed it in the front pocket of her pack. The library was one room, smelling of old binding glue and the particular stillness of books that hadn't been moved in a long time. She explained what she was looking for to the librarian, a tall woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and within 20 minutes they had located a university surplus equipment catalog from 1994, thin and dense with small print. They worked through it together at the reading table, the astronomer's measurements written in pencil on a scrap of paper she'd copied from his journal. Compatible parts existed. A replacement lens assembly, second-hand, listed at $28. She placed the order by phone from the library's front desk, reading out the catalog number twice, giving the post office address in town, and setting the receiver down with her heart moving fast and quiet in her chest. She had $3 left. The woman at the general store gave her credit for a paper bag of groceries without being asked twice. A can of beans, a box of crackers, 2 apples, a small jar of peanut butter. She wrote down the amount herself in a small ledger she produced from beneath the counter and said simply, "Pay when you can." She walked back up the mountain in the dark with a flashlight and the bag against her chest, the form folded in her pocket, the mountain solid beneath her feet. The journal entry was dated March of 1935, written in his careful hand across 2 full pages, more than he usually gave to a single night. 3 families came up from the valley. The Hendersons brought a lantern and a tin of shortbread. The Purcell children ran between the trees until dark fell, and then stood perfectly still, looking up, as children do when they finally understand the size of things. I had not expected to feel what I felt. I have spent 14 years looking at the sky alone, and believed that was sufficient. But to watch a woman press her eye to the lens and go quiet, completely quiet, and then say nothing for a long moment, only reach back and find her husband's hand. I understood something about this work I had not understood before. It is not diminished by being shared. It is, I think, only completed by it. She read the entry twice in the glow of the lantern, the wool blanket around her shoulders, the fixed patch of sky visible through the small dome above. The package arrived on a Tuesday. She knew because she had been counting. 9 days since she'd placed the order. 9 mornings of waking early and lying still in the narrow bed, listening to the mountains settle around her. She hiked down in the clear morning light, and the woman at the post office counter handed her a flat cardboard box with both hands, as though she understood it mattered. She carried it back up the fire road without opening it. The retired machinist arrived the following morning, as he'd said he would, driving a dusty pickup to the end of the road and hiking the last half-mile with a canvas tool roll over one shoulder. He was a quiet man, methodical, unhurried, and he studied the broken telescope mount for a long time before touching anything. He asked her to read him the journal's technical notes aloud while he worked, and she did, standing beside the mount, with the small cloth-bound book open in her hands, translating the astronomer's careful measurements into plain directions. It took 2 full days. The first day was disassembly and cleaning, decades of grime, a seized focuser ring that required patient persuasion, a clockwork tracking arm that had frozen mid-rotation. She handed tools and held components still, and learned the names of things. The second afternoon, the machinist fitted the new lens assembly into the optical train, aligned the tube by micrometer, and stepped back. She put her eye to the eyepiece. The stars resolved, sharp, brilliant, immediate, as though they had been waiting just on the other side of that cracked glass all along. Neither of them spoke. She straightened up and looked at him, and he gave a single nod, the way a man does when something has been done right, and words would only crowd it. The paperwork had taken weeks to assemble. A careful stack of county records photocopied at the library, a handwritten occupancy log she'd kept since July, a letter from the postmistress, confirming she received mail at the general store under this address. The clerk at the county office was a precise woman, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she'd spread the documents across her desk without hurry, examining each page. Then she'd looked up and said, "It'll take time, months, likely, but you have standing." She'd driven back up the mountain in the borrowed truck with those 2 words sitting in her chest like ballast. You have standing. 9 people came on the first evening. She'd posted a single index card at the general store 3 weeks before. Stargazing, Observatory Ridge, October 14th. Bring a flashlight and something warm, and hadn't known whether anyone would bother. They came anyway, 2 older couples, a man who'd worked the timber roads for 30 years and recognized the dome from a distance, a woman who taught school in the next valley, 3 others she didn't know by name. They hiked up by flashlight in the cold autumn dark, thermoses tucked under their arms, breath showing white. She'd lit the dome with all 3 lanterns. The repaired telescope stood at the center, the clockwork tracking arm ticking its slow, patient arc, the eyepiece aimed at what she'd chosen first, Saturn, low and steady in the southwest, the rings tilted just enough to see clearly. She guided them through it one by one, adjusting the focus for each eye, answering questions she'd spent 4 months learning how to answer. The timberman looked for a long time and said nothing, then stood straight and pressed his fist briefly to his sternum, which told her everything. The schoolteacher asked if she could bring her students in the spring. She said yes before she'd finished thinking it. The last guests left near midnight. Their flashlight beams moved down through the trees in a slow, diminishing scatter. And then the forest swallowed them, and there was only the silence, and the cold, and the stars overhead, dense and indifferent and extraordinary. She descended the ladder to the hidden room, pulled the trapdoor closed above her, and lit the single lantern on the writing desk. The whitewashed walls held the light the way they always did, steadily, without fuss. She lay back on the narrow iron bed and looked up through the fixed circular skylight at the patch of sky the astronomer had framed decades ago and never stopped watching. The cluster was there, the same stars, the same small fixed corner of the universe, patient as stone. She did not think about the road. She did not calculate the distance to anywhere else. The thought simply did not come. She pulled the wool blanket to her chin, and she stayed.